Hey everyone, welcome back to another painting review. As always, my name is Jay, and in this video, as requested by you, I'm going to put Contrast Apothecary White to the test against its main competitor. Ooh, Holy White by, of course, Army Painter's Speedpaint line. For those who don't know, of course, Contrast has been out now for about 4 years. One of my most popular videos, which I didn't even think was going to happen, it was the Apothecary White video. And people are saying now that, Speedpaint came out last year, and the new lines come out this year, the 2.0 line. Which one's better? What are the pros and cons of each one? Which one would you recommend overall? So I figured, let's put them to the test. I have never actually used Holy White yet, and Apothecary White's a color that I use occasionally, but not very often, since I'm not painting a lot of white surfaces on models, whilst be painting my models. So let's compare and contrast the paints. No pun intended. So of course, let's start off with Apothecary White. As you can see here, this paint pot has been really separated, but it's much more expensive of a paint to purchase versus the Speedpaint line, and some people do not like painting out of the pots. Some people like painting out of the pots, but as you can see here, this one really separates a lot. And of course, in the other corner, Holy White by Speedpaint line from Army Painter. A benefit of this paint is that, of course, it isn't a dropper. It has a ball that mixes it, but it's, as I said, people are giving it mixed reviews. So, to start off with, of course, I had to give them both a huge shaking because, as you can see, they're both very separated. I had to use a vortex mixer, and I vortex mix each one for about 3 to 5 minutes to get it to the right mixing. I never actually used the Holy White before, so it was, it was separated entirely. And of course, the Contrast White was also very separated. These are two very thin paints, and therefore they separate very easily. So that's the first thing, of course. Both of them, it took approximately the same amount of mixing to get them to the correct consistency and mixture that I wanted to use them. After mixing them, as you can see here, they both look a lot better, and they're of uniform consistency of color, and that's where I wanted to get started. So, as you can see now, they're mixed and they look great, which is nice all throughout. And then they're both shades of gray. And as you can see, they're both very similar shades of gray. Just off the top, you can see Contrast Apothecary White looks a little lighter. It does, but maybe that could be the paint pots. And for today's experiment, I'm using these Orc Boys. I had a bunch of these Orc Boys primed white using the Stynylrez White Primer. A benefit of using these particular models, actually there's several benefits of using these models. Number one, I had a bunch lying around so I could paint a bunch of them using these paints to compare them. Number two, they actually have a lot of texture. As you can see, there's the wood grain on the axe, there is a bunch of different armor, there's the skin. It actually is a great test model for this experiment. So, I began with taking a plastic hard palette. Now the reason why I'm using a plastic hard palette is because I don't like to use these paints on my wet palette. So I just cleaned it out, and of course, and I inserted a little bit of paint to the palette, right? I just put it on the palette, enough that I would use per model. I started out with the Holy White, and of course I took my shading brush from the Citadel line. That's what I use for my painting of these paints because it destroys all my brushes. The contrast paints and the speed paint as well. And then I just took my the paint and I put it on the model. I made sure to get adequate coverage over the entire model, but of course the main key is don't let it build up too much. So if you find it just really pooling in an area, I would then just dry off my brush and quickly just remove some of the excess. And then, of course, I repeated the same process with the Citadel Contrast paints as well. Put them into the same hard palette in a different section of the palette, of course. Took my same brush and applied a very, decent coat to the miniature. Once again, getting entire coverage in one attempt. And then I just removed the excess from the pooling whenever I noticed it was building up. Now, I let them dry for a while because they really needed to dry, and they both took several hours, but on the left-hand side is the speed paint. On the right-hand side is the contrast. And what I noticed was, number one, the speed paint was darker. The one on the right is a little bit lighter. So the one on the right is the contrast, the one on the left is the speed paint. And yeah, so it was darker, and also it didn't tend to when it dried, the raised areas weren't as white for the speed paint than it was for the contrast. I found the raised areas for the speed paint were more of a gray. The contrast were more white. But then I figured, let's take the same paints and do a little bit of a dry brush just to bring up the raised edges and see if it removes this difference. Because whenever I'm painting white anyway, I'd always do a quick dry brush or edge highlight just to bring up the whites. So I took some white scar paint and I did a quick dry brush over both models. So first of all, once again, this is the speed paint model, and I'm just going to do a light dry brush and to pick up the raised edges and just to show what it looks like. And I was curious in my mind if the difference between these two models, if these two paints would be minimized with a quick dry brush. And then I did the same thing with the other model painted with Citadel Contrast paints. Once again, just doing a quick dry brush, picking up on the raised surfaces, building back the textures, and just bring some more white to it. Once again, just want to see what the difference is with these models once I've painted the dry brush of white over the original contrast base coat. And once again, after letting them dry, here are the results. As you can see, the one on the left is the one painted with the speed paint Holy White, and the one on the right is the one painted in the contrast Apothecary White. And once again, going back to my original point, I found that the speed paint one is a little darker of a gray and dried a little bit darker on the model, and also was a little streakier, I found, versus the contrast paint on the right. The paint really settled in the recesses, but left the raised surfaces a lot more white. And this was, and unfortunately, even after a quick dry brush of white, I still found that the difference was still there. So that, once again, both could potentially pass off as a quick way to paint white, but in this particular case, I did like the result of the contrast Apothecary White more than the speed paint Holy White, because as you can see, it's much more cleaner on the right-hand side than it is on the left-hand side of these models. And so, the overall winner, I'd have to say, is, in this case, the Citadel Color Contrast Apothecary White. It went on a little bit smoother. When it settled, it did leave the raised surfaces a bit more white, and it looked a bit cleaner in the end when I did a quick dry brush. Of course, both paints are decent. You can use both of them if you want to paint a speedy white, but I just found in this particular example that I really did prefer the Apothecary White over the speed paint Holy White. So that's my quick comparison between the speed paint Holy White and the Apothecary White from Citadel. As I mentioned, they both need a very good shake. They both go on pretty well. What I recommend is to do a solid coat and then remove the excess. What I found is that when they dried, the Holy White was a bit darker and didn't settle as cleanly as the Apothecary White did over the same miniature. And then once you did a quick dry brush of white over both of them, the difference was still there. Personally, if I was to choose between the two, I'd choose the Citadel. So stay tuned for more painting reviews. Please like this video, comment in the comment section down below what you think. Have you tried both paints? And let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed this review. Stay tuned for more videos. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting.